and culminated in the passage of the Parliament Act in 1911, which effectively removed the House of Lords' right of veto over financial measures. So if you're looking for a moment when the aristocracy loses an important part of its political power, 1911 would be a very good place to look. Now, we've covered a lot of this ground already, so what I'm going to say about the women's suffrage movement was that the Women's Social and Political Union, rather like new unionists, began to adopt increasingly militant strategies for the purpose of dramatising the exclusion of women from the vote. In 1905, they began disrupting the meetings of the Liberal Party leaders and MPs. In 1908, they began to launch attacks on public property, mainly, silly things like, setting letterboxes on fire, some other arson attacks. In 1909, they begin to conduct hunger strikes. The government is so appalled at the prospect of potentially being custodians of hunger striking suffragettes who die, that they introduce this measure, the Cat and Mouse Act, which tries to manage the problem by releasing women who declare a hunger strike, letting them out of jail until such time where they recover their physical strength, and then trying to rearrest them and put them back into jail. Okay? Not a great strategy, and of course it was hopelessly unsuccessful. But it was a better alternative than the use of force feeding, which you see illustrated behind me, because this is basically what they did from 1909 down to 1913, and then again in the second half of 1913 and 1914 when they abandoned the Cat and Mouse Act. They introduced forcible feeding straight out of mental health asylums. And it becomes hugely contentious, both within the medical profession itself, where the doctors should be used as instruments of the state, but also within the population as a large. And the suffragettes used it to illustrate that women's subjugation, the denial of the vote to women, could only be maintained by the use of physical force against them. They were saying, look, it's not our militancy which is the issue here. It's the illiberal use of force by a liberal government and a liberal state which should be brought to the attention of people. And lastly, Ireland, and in a way most importantly. So you remember that Gladstone had introduced the first Home Rule Bill in 1886. He has another go in the dying embers of his last administration in 1893. And there is, which actually passed. The 1893, the Home Rule Bill of 1893 is passed by the House of Commons with a majority of 34. It's rejected by the House of Lords. 1912, there's another Home Rule Bill. And the House of Lords basically does its best to reject it for as long as it possibly can, which was two years. But after 2 years, it was going to lose its ability to throw the measure out. And what this does is catalyse the Protestant minority in Ireland to reject the bill. And so you have the beginning of paramilitary mobilisation in Ireland. Well, not the beginning, but an important phase of paramilitary organisation with the launch of the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1913, and then the response of the nationalist movement also to try and counteract the threat of the Ulster Volunteer Force, which claimed it had something like 300,000 members. No, that's totally wrong. Sorry, I've just given you a figure for something completely different. Anyway, let me move on, because the key issue here is that the Home Rule Bill is finally passed in 1914. But with the baddest of all possible luck, it's passed in August of 1914 and then suspended the following month when Britain declares war on Germany and the First World War begins. The leader of the Irish nationalists, John Redmond, immediately commits his supporters to supporting the war effort, and vast numbers of people, 300,000, volunteer to join up. There was no conscription in Ireland until very, very late. It was the suspension of Home Rule that here again split the nationalist movement. And there were those who refused to let the war provide a break to the claims of the Irish nation for independence from Britain. And they, very small minority, launched a rising in April 1916, an attempt to take armed control of the state. They captured the Dublin Post Office and sought to use that as the basis of a wider mobilisation against the British state. But in fact, all those people that were meant to join them around the country evaporate, and there is a violent suppression of the rising in Britain. You see behind me the destruction of the Dublin Post Office where they were holed up fighting. 500 people are killed during the repression of the movement, and 15 of its leaders were executed by the British. So again, here we have another illustration of the use of physical force to maintain not just the empire, but to keep the use of physical force against those making their claim to the universal rights promised for citizenship. Okay, I feel so inarticulate today. So I can't wait to conclude and get out of here. My only excuse is I got off a plane at midnight last night. Okay, so let me try and wrap up. And what I've been trying to say to you today is that key to these series of lectures is the recognition that Britain is operating in a new type of global era in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that fundamentally altered the ways in which the liberalism that had triumphed and become the common sense during the 19th century, had to be adjusted and challenged. It was in this era of global competition that these fundamental challenges to liberalism were made manifest. To free trade, and the idea of cheap government, which you can see with the new liberal, after the People's Budget had gone out of the window in some ways. To the idea of a benevolent, civilizing empire in India, in South Africa, in Ireland, became a clear fiction. to the idea of the rule of law, which both across the empire and in Britain itself seemed to be suspended at will when the British state wanted to put down those people who were campaigning for their rights or making claims upon the state. And finally, the idea that eventually everybody was going to get the right to be represented. That universal claim or promise of liberalism that one day when you're big enough, when you're grown up enough, you too will be treated like an adult and get the right to vote. All of these things were dramatically exposed to be a fiction in the decades that I've been talking about today. And importantly, they're exposed as a fiction by political mobilization, not just in Britain, but across its empire as well. Ireland and India are a really key part of this story. Now, the big question that you have to figure out before you get into the midterm is whether you think that these challenges that I've been talking about today, and the challenges that I'm going to talk about in the First World War on Tuesday, meant that this era, this liberal era of the 19th century, came to an end. This is a question that has preoccupied historians of Britain for decades. And so you have to try and figure out quite how widespread, how significant these challenges were, and what was left of the idea of liberal England at the end of the First World War. And if you do that, you'll be in good shape for the midterm. Does anyone have any questions that I can try and answer and clarify some of the absolute tripe that I've just given you? I just threw an enormous amount of different things at you, and in an utterly inarticulate way for 90% of the time. So someone must have a question. Thank you, Eric, sporting that very fine new haircut. Oh, history coming to a period. There's a great book that I'll talk to you about on Tuesday called 1066 and all that. And it's a triumphal account of Britain's past, rather similar to the triumphal version of Britain's past that the current Minister of Education wants to make compulsorily taught in British schools. And it has this idea that at the end of the First World War, America becomes top dog, and therefore history comes to a period, because Britain is no longer at the centre. But I'll cover that on, I'm not sure why I've got that there, just to confuse you. Any other questions? Yeah?
Did you say that liberalism will constantly end, or that its right choice?
Well, dun dun dun, that is the question that only you can answer. And on that note, we're going to end.